This image of reindeer in the Arctic with their antlers entangled in fishing net stopped me in my tracks. We have a garbage problem. But before I can tell you about how I became interested in plastic pollution in the Arctic, come with me far south for a moment, to Antarctica. Why Antarctica? Growing up in northern Ontario, I thought I was near the North Pole, but I was barely in the subarctic. Then at university, here in Montreal, I became obsessed with going. I used to love to spin the globe and look at the Arctic, this white mass at the top of the Earth, and spin it over and see this white continent, this frozen continent at the bottom. Did we forget about it because it was tucked under there? I was curious. Antarctica obsessed me. There were no borders and no permanent population. About 3,000 to 5,000 people a year go to Antarctica temporarily, scientists, support staff, and tourists go. But a tiny fraction of us go to this place. What I love about Antarctica is its governance, the fact that countries during the Cold War said, let's dedicate this continent to peace and science. It was a pioneering treaty, the first nuclear arms treaty in the world, and the first time we said no nuclear dumping here. We decided that the common good of humankind was important here. And we also said that science is a tool of diplomacy. Well, how was I going to get there? Being so remote, it was so expensive. A friend of mine was working for an ecotourism company, Pat, and he said, Carol, there is so much garbage in the Antarctic. Why don't you find one of these research stations and get them to host you, find volunteers, and we'll bring you there on our ships. Well, that was a big undertaking, but I put one foot in front of the other. I wrote letters to countries that had research stations in Antarctica, the US, UK, Poland, Russia, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Russia wrote me back and said, help us clean up. The timing was good because this Antarctic treaty that dedicated the continent to peace and science added an additional protocol, an environmental protocol that said, we also have to better manage the environment and monitor ourselves. So then I had to find expedition team, a cook, and volunteers. But the volunteers came, and we cleaned up a tiny fraction of the pollution that was there, but we shined a light on the problem. And this is the Russian research station, and I led the first civilian cleanup expedition, and it was called the Joint Russian-Canadian Ecological Expedition. And we were there with the Russians at one of their stations. And what we found were age-old abandoned fuel pipes, paint chips, cigarette butts, nails, empty fridges. But something that surprised me was some of the garbage had also come from the ocean, it appeared. So how does this mess in our oceans happen? 8 million tons of garbage are in our oceans. That's one dump truck every minute. Well, humans are sloppy. 80% of the garbage that ends up in the oceans comes from land-based activities. We're sloppy, and we leave trash near beaches, and it gets into riverways and into the oceans. Another way is inadvertently or sloppily because ships that they dump by mistake containers of plastics. Also, plastic factories. A fraction of the garbage comes from plastic factories that are near waterways. And another percentage comes from these tiny fibers, which are microfibers that come from our fleece and synthetic clothing and gets into waterways. And the garbage lasts a really long time to decompose. So here's the design flaw. Plastics were supposed to make our lives easier, but they haven't, and they can take generations to decompose. Socks, 1 to 5 years, plastic bags, 20 years, and then we get into 50 to 400 years. Styrofoam cups, 50 years. And then those plastic beverage holders, not only do they last for 450 or so years, but they tangle animals in them. And then things that we use, plastic disposable diapers and sanitary products, 500 years. So how does this garbage travel around the world? Well, just quickly to say, we have these things called gyres you will have heard of. Gyres are these vast whirlpools that are caused by the Earth's rotation and by wind-driven currents. And there's 5 big gyres, these whirlpools that are full of plastics, and more are forming, one in the Arctic. And the plastics move around, and they become this soup, and then the soup gets ingested by animals. So here are the 3 problems. Just that animals mistake it for garbage. Seals think that plastic bags are jellyfish, and we're just learning that animals and sea life actually like the taste of it. This seal got caught in plastic, and in the Arctic, a band of plastic, and it grew, and unfortunately, it died. And 4 out of 5 seabirds have plastics in their stomachs, so they die of starvation or because of that plastic. And the other reason that plastics are dangerous, of course, is that they ingest it, and then we ingest it. It gets into our food chain. So I joined an expedition recently this summer called Expedition, and it was an all-women sailing expedition. And what we were doing was sampling waters around the UK for plastics and also toxins, particularly to look at how toxins affect women's health. And I'm sorry to say, in every single water sample that we trawled in the water, we found plastics, visible and quite invisible, these microplastics. The United Nations Environmental Program said that plastic pollution is a global problem on par with climate change, and in fact it's interrelated. And also that these microplastics, these tiny plastics, threaten human health and marine ecosystems. So I'd been to the Antarctic, and now I wanted to go to the Arctic decades later and see what the plastic was happening up there. And I came across this initiative called Clean Up Svalbard. Svalbard is an archipelago of islands at the top of the world, the northernmost inhabited place on Earth, but 3,000 people and about 3,000 polar bears. And the governor of Svalbard was finding so much plastic pollution because there are many fjords and beaches, and he started cleaning up with locals and going on ships and going around and cleaning. Because that's one way to reduce plastic pollution, to actually intercept it and remove it. And then he invited international people, so I joined people from 18 countries. From the ship, we couldn't see the plastics. And as we got closer, there was herds of walruses, icy, freezing waters, and these sugar-coated mountains. But behind these logs that floated in from Siberia and under rocks was green, blue plastic. A lot of it was fishing equipment, but it was also these tiny fragments. We would pick up a piece of plastic rope and it would disintegrate in our hands, and then we knew, where does that go? So we did this cleanup, and we found household waste, food packaging from many countries, alcohol bottles that still smelled of alcohol. But something that caught my eye and surprised me the most were children's toys and this doll's head. Who played with this doll? How did it get way up here? Well, we cleaned up 10 nautical miles of garbage, 13.5 cubic meters, about the size of a big shipping container. But again, it was just a fraction. I want to bring you back to these reindeer, but to tell you, when I went to the cabin with my garbage, my roommate said, "Carol, are you seriously bringing more crap into our cabin? And I said yes, and that crap, as Grace said, is going to be in the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. I want us to look at ourselves and look at our consumption. So these reindeer. I was dying to know what happened to them. I needed to know. And I searched and I tracked down the photographer, and his name is Svenig Raman. And he was out snowmobiling in a northern island and came across the reindeer. And he said, we had a dilemma. If we don't cut the rope, they will die slowly. But also they know that interfering with wildlife is dangerous and that they shouldn't do it. Well, I got teary when he sent me this photo. They were able to cut the rope. But that is extremely rare. Most animals die out of sight. And they die because we're leaving our garbage everywhere. We shouldn't be doing this. This is an indictment of us humans. So we have to clean up our act. If we can create an Antarctic treaty that dedicates a continent to peace and science, and that says we need to collaborate and we have limited resources, then we can do it for all of the world and for all peoples. In my own life, I try to reduce plastic pollution, but it's really difficult. There's so much single-use plastic. I refuse straws and plastic bags. But there's also so many innovations and efforts today, so we need to ramp it up together. If we can do this together, we can do it for each other, for these species. It's not only about animals. We are interconnected. We can do it for Mother Earth and for future generations. Thank you. Thank you.